And so, imagine that a huge spider has settled in your house. Well, no, not just a huge one, but a super huge spider that also feeds on people. What do you do in this situation? And now let's see what the characters of this film did in this situation. An elderly woman named Helga, who has dementia, enjoys knitting quietly while watching TV. Suddenly, a noise from the vent startles her. She calls for an exterminator, and he asks for her name and address. Struggling with her memory, Helga reads them off scraps of paper. A short time later, the exterminator, Frank, arrives. As he nears Helga's apartment, he notices a foul-smelling liquid seeping from the vent and hears the strange noise. When Frank knocks, Helga answers, but has already forgotten about the call and the noise. Hearing it again, Frank is invited in to investigate. Following a trail of blood, Frank discovers a fellow exterminator bleeding within the vent. As he's examining the area, he hears another noise, and suddenly, something lunges at him, causing him to scream. Helga watches in shock as Frank tries to crawl out, only to be dragged back inside. But with her dementia, she soon forgets what she's witnessed, returning peacefully to her knitting and TV. Later, she hears a noise again and dials another exterminator. 4 days earlier, a fiery object descends from space, crashing into New York, breaking a window in a storeroom, and landing inside a toy house. Inside the object is an egg, from which a small spider emerges. Not long after, Helga's granddaughter, Charlotte, sneaks into the storeroom to swipe a doll and post it on Instagram. Suddenly, she notices the spider on her hand. Hearing someone approaching, she quickly hides the spider in an empty matchbox and escapes through the vent. Helga's sister, Gunther, enters the storeroom to investigate and notices the broken window, panicking as she rushes to find Ethan, her stepdaughter's father. Charlotte listens as Gunther blames her for breaking into the storeroom. Furious, Ethan decides to confront his stepdaughter. Charlotte rushes back to her room, hiding the spider in a jar before Ethan can check on her. He questions her, asking if she was in Gunther's apartment. Charlotte denies it, and their tense relationship is clear. Before he can press her, Ethan's phone rings. It's Sandy from the publishing house, calling about his comic book. Charlotte names the spider sting, snaps a picture of him, and posts it on Instagram. Her mother, Heather, soon asks her to watch Liam, her half-brother, so she can work. While Charlotte watches over her brother, she becomes bored and checks on Sting. Aside from being a comic artist, Ethan also works as the building's part-time superintendent. While fixing pipes in a neighbor's apartment, a cockroach startles him, landing on his face. Once he finishes the job, Maria, the apartment owner, thanks him. She is a widow who lost her 2 sons, and she reminds Ethan to appreciate his family. While Charlotte feeds a cockroach to Sting, Ethan tackles another repair in the basement and takes out the garbage. After a long day, he returns home to take care of baby Liam, while Heather goes to check on her mother, Helga, who's watching TV with her aunt Gunther. As Heather tucks her mother into bed, Helga tells her she knitted Charlotte a sweater with a moth design. Then, drifting into her memories, she urges Heather to meet her daughter, unaware that Heather is indeed her daughter. Helga then drifts off to sleep. Ethan is hard at work on his latest comic book, but takes a moment to bond with his stepdaughter, showing her a character he's drawn, a professor inspired by Charlotte's father. They share a brief moment over the sketch before Heather steps in, asking Charlotte to set the dinner table and thanking Ethan for being so caring with her daughter. Later, Ethan heads to Charlotte's room to tuck her in, but she's not there. He notices a sketch of a giant spider and a jar labeled Sting, but before he spots the spider itself, Charlotte comes in. Ethan tucks her in, says goodnight, and leaves. While Charlotte sleeps, Sting quietly opens the jar and crawls into the vent. Gunther's parrot notices Sting's movement and tries to warn the sleeping Gunther. The next morning, the family has breakfast together. Charlotte tries to talk with Ethan and her mother, but they're engrossed in a discussion about work and responsibilities. Frustrated, Charlotte leaves the table in a huff. Ethan then asks Heather when she plans to tell Charlotte that her father has been back in town for 6 months, but hasn't made any effort to see her. Heather assures him she'll tell Charlotte when the time is right. She also reminds Ethan to look after their son, Liam. before heading to her own tasks. The day moves along, and everyone gets busy with their routines. Suddenly, a piercing scream from Gunter's floor echoes through the building. Ethan rushes upstairs to find that Gunter's parrot has been killed, skinned, and pinned inside its cage. Gunter has him call Frank. The exterminator. Frank arrives and inspects the scene, theorizing that whatever killed the parrot was small enough to travel through the vents. Convinced it's an infestation, he decides to fumigate the entire building. Meanwhile, Charlotte brings a bag full of cockroaches to feed Sting. She whistles, and Sting mimics her whistle to signal that he's hungry. A mothball accidentally rolls toward the jar, causing Sting to panic until Charlotte removes it. It seems that the mothball can dissolve Sting's web, making it his greatest weakness. Charlotte is also excited to see that Sting has grown larger. As Frank sprays the building, he reaches Ethan's apartment, including Charlotte's room. She stops him just in time, saying she doesn't want her spider to be hurt by the pesticide. Frank suggests she get a dog instead, mentioning that spiders only know how to eat and kill. Later that night, Maria dozes off in front of the TV. Her dog senses something in the vent and starts barking loudly, waking Maria. Annoyed, she sends the dog out of the room and takes her medication, unaware that Sting is creeping closer. She glances at a picture of her late husband and sons, feeling a wave of sadness. In that moment, Sting suddenly lunges at her, stinging her cheek. Maria stumbles back, hitting her head. Rushing to the bathroom, she examines her face in the mirror, horrified to see her cheek swelling and turning a deep shade of purple. She vomits before collapsing, hitting the back of her head on the edge of the bathtub. Paralyzed, Maria can't move anything but her eyes. Sting crawls into her mouth to finish her off. With Sting growing larger, Charlotte visits Eric to borrow a fish tank. Eric, a biology student who conducts animal experiments in his apartment, is curious and takes a look at Sting. When Charlotte whistles, Sting mimics her sound, leaving Eric in disbelief. Spiders don't have vocal cords, he points out. Charlotte explains that Sting isn't an ordinary spider and feeds him a cockroach, which Eric finds impressive. Charlotte also shows Eric how large Sting has become. Eric suggests Charlotte leave Sting with him until he can secure a safe tank, as he wants to make sure Sting won't escape. Charlotte agrees, but warns him to keep it a secret from Ethan. Meanwhile, Heather and Ethan are arguing when a noise from the vent distracts them. Ethan goes to investigate, but is startled when something rushes at him, causing him to fall backward. It's only Maria's dog. Ethan tries to return the dog, but Maria doesn't answer the door. Using the skeleton key, he enters her apartment and finds Maria's body. He calls the police and explains what he's found. As he answers questions, a call from Eric interrupts him, asking for his immediate presence. At Eric's place, Ethan learns about Sting. Eric reveals that Sting is venomous, possibly deadly, and that Charlotte has been keeping him as a pet. Eric suggests they contact the Department of Health and Safety, given Sting's size and toxicity. Eric shows Ethan how massive Sting has become, terrifying him. Back at home, Ethan confronts Charlotte about keeping a dangerous spider. Furious, Charlotte storms over to Eric's apartment to retrieve Sting, but Eric refuses to return him. Charlotte accuses Ethan of siding with Eric and tells him his comic book is terrible, especially since he killed off her favorite character, who was based on her father. Charlotte claims her father, whom she believes is in Thailand, is far better than Ethan. Ethan finally reveals the truth to Charlotte. Her father has been back in town for 6 months and hasn't bothered to visit her. Heartbroken, Charlotte storms off to her room. Heather scolds Ethan for undermining Charlotte's view of her father and damaging her self-esteem, reminding him it was never his decision to tell her. Instead of handing Sting over to the Department of Health and Safety, Eric decides to keep him for selfish reasons, hoping to make Sting grow even larger by feeding him bigger animals. While Eric sleeps deeply, Sting grows so much that he breaks free from the large fish tank. Meanwhile, Ethan works on fixing the heater and receives a voice message from Sandy at the publishing house, who says his comic book isn't working out. Frustrated, Ethan angrily takes it out on the heater. Gunter arrives and reprimands Ethan for his clumsiness, promising to fire him next month. When Ethan asks why she's so antagonistic, Gunter accuses him of being weak, someone who gives up when times are tough, and vows to keep him away from her niece. This deeply unsettles Ethan. Gunter returns to her apartment and, noticing her cat is missing, hears its cries from the vent. She crawls inside to investigate, but her flashlight flickers out. Suddenly, Sting lunges at her, pulling her further into the vent. As the days pass, Ethan becomes increasingly frustrated with his life. While fixing a TV cable, he receives a minor electric shock, loses his temper, and hits the TV screen, scaring the children. Heather asks Charlotte to take her brother to the other room, then confronts Ethan about his outburst. Charlotte, with her headphones on, watches videos on her phone as Heather and Ethan argue. Suddenly, Sting attacks them, paralyzing them both and dragging them away. Oblivious to the danger, Charlotte doesn't notice anything until she hears Maria's dog barking. Thinking he's just hungry, she heads to the kitchen to get him some food, unaware that Sting is dragging her stepfather toward the vent. When the dog keeps barking, Charlotte investigates the apartment and panics upon discovering her mom and stepdad missing. She spots the open vent and realizes Sting has taken them. Attempting to reach out for help, she realizes there's no internet. Charlotte tries to leave the apartment but finds the windows and doors locked. The dog has also vanished. Recognizing Sting is behind all this, she blocks the open vent to prevent him from returning. Just then, Sting sneaks up behind her, grabs her baby brother Liam, and escapes through another vent. Charlotte screams in horror, begging Sting to return her brother. Overcome with regret, wherever bringing Sting home, she resolves to fight him. Determined, she dons the moth sweater her grandmother made, arms herself with a water gun loaded with mothball water, Sting's greatest weakness, and prepares to confront him. Hoping to find help, Charlotte goes to Eric's apartment, only to discover him tied up in Sting's web, hanging from the ceiling. Shocked and frightened, she then heads to check on her grandmother. Charlotte attempts to call the police using the landline, but there's no signal. She advises her grandmother to keep her moth shawl on to protect herself from Sting. Gathering additional mothballs from Helga's apartment, Charlotte makes more moth water and douses herself with it before setting off to find Sting. Meanwhile, Ethan struggles to escape from Sting's webbing but ends up burning his hand. Hearing his cries, Charlotte finally locates him and frees him from the web. Around the same time, Frank, the exterminator, arrives in response to Helga's call about the noise. As Ethan is about to climb out of the vent, he hears Liam's voice. Charlotte warns him not to be hasty. Suddenly, Sting appears and attacks them, causing them to fall into the dumpster in the basement. Charlotte briefly loses consciousness, but opens her eyes to find Sting looming over her. Ethan quickly intervenes, scaring Sting away with mothball water. Charlotte breaks down, feeling guilty for keeping such a dangerous pet and for the harm it's caused. Ethan reassures her, telling her it's not her fault and promising they'll make it through this together. Just then, Sting hurls Frank into the garbage room. Frank angrily chastises Charlotte for keeping Sting as a pet. Desperate to escape, Frank attempts to unlock the back door, but is jammed. He becomes aggressive, demanding Ethan hand over the key, but all Ethan has is the bottle of mothball water to fend off Sting. Frank snatches it, dousing himself, but Ethan warns him it's their only line of defense. Armed with a nail gun, Frank prepares to fight Sting. When Sting enters through the vent, Frank panics, firing shots wildly. He misses Sting, accidentally hitting the sprinkler system. As water sprays down, it washes off the mothball water they had applied, leaving them exposed to Sting. Sting then traps Frank in his web, pulling him into the vent and gruesomely attacking him, horrifying Ethan and Charlotte. They retreat to the garbage compactor, where they find Heather and Liam ensnared in Sting's web. Using the last of their moth water, Ethan melts the webbing and frees them. Reunited, Ethan embraces Heather and Liam, and Charlotte joins in, realizing how much her family means to her. As Sting approaches, Ethan attempts to close the compactor door to crush him, but it won't budge without power. He rushes to plug it in, while Charlotte does her best to hold Sting off. Sting overpowers Charlotte, preparing to strike the family. At the last second, Ethan plugs in the compactor, but is electrocuted and collapses. Charlotte manages to press the button, closing the door and crushing Sting, finally ending the threat. Heather pulls Ethan from the compactor, frantically attempting to revive him. Closing her eyes, Charlotte counts to 3, 1, 2, 3. Ethan gasps back to life, and Charlotte, calling him dad for the first time, tells him she loves him. The family shares a heartfelt embrace, relieved to have survived, but unbeknownst to them, a nest of unhatched spider eggs remains nearby, waiting.